The third weekly roundup will start to cover the identities. This is where you were introduced to many studies and started to develop your extended writing.
You will need to know about 8 different identities. These are outlined in the specification, so you could be directly asked about any one of them, and your 20-mark question is most likely to be an identities question. I've used the acrostic in your question bank of changed to illustrate how you could be asked about any of these. I strongly suggest that you have a go at answering questions on each of these identities, as any can come up. So the identities, so C was class identities, H hybrid identities, A age identities, N national identities, G gender identities, E ethnic identities, D disability and identity, and finally sexuality and identity. You don't need to go away and recite these, but you need to be prepared for questions based on any of these.
The first identity which we looked at was disability and identity. We spoke about the language and spoke about the stigma which can come from using words like disabled. This was just to get you thinking about the topic before we studied it closely. Disability is an identity which often people don't consider. This is because most people are living without an impairment, so they don't necessarily see it as a fundamental feature of anyone's identity. Yet those people with an impairment will see it as a major part of their identity. This is often due to how other people see them. It is not always down to how they see themselves. We will touch on this later on in this video and give you some examples of studies that we could use to state this. There has been some improvement in the representation of disabilities. The Paralympics has played a huge role in this, and there's also TV shows like The Last Leg, which continue to raise the profile of people with disabilities. There are 2 approaches to understanding disability. These are the medical model and the social model. You can use these in your exam in the same way that you would use a study. So this image illustrates the medical model. As you can see, this is the traditional view, one that is now very much seen as outdated by many areas in society. The medical model sees the disabled person as being the problem. The medical model sees disability as purely a medical problem. The understanding can be seen as an issue, as it can lead to victim-blaming mentality. From this perspective, society isn't at fault. The person's body is making their daily life more challenging. They aren't able to fit in within able-bodied society. A sociologist you can use when writing about the medical model is Shakespeare. He argues that disabled people are often socialised by society into this way of seeing themselves. He said, "The person with impairment may have an investment in their own incapacity, because it can become the rationale for their own failure." He's suggesting that disabled people are socialised into thinking that they aren't able to do things, and this means that they believe that they are incapable, so don't try. This therefore creates a victim mentality in the individual. They think there's no point, as they won't be successful anyway. The other model is the social model, and this is more recent and is seen as more valued in many areas of society. The social model of disability sees society as being the problem. This model suggests that there are many barriers in society which cause people with a disability or impairment to not be able to fully engage with society. They can't engage in the same way as the able-bodied people can. So the social model focuses on how society could adapt so that there aren't social and physical barriers preventing disabled people from becoming fully engaged members of society. This model encourages institutions in society to become more inclusive by making adaptations so differently abled people don't feel excluded. The social model suggests that society is the disabling factor. disability is socially constructed, as it makes the assumptions of what is deemed as normal and what is seen as abnormal. Some people see the term disabled as problematic, as it suggests that people who fall under this category aren't at all able, so some people campaign for the use of the term differently abled. We can also use Shakespeare for the social model, as he argues that there are major obstacles or barriers which prevent people from forming positive disabled identities. They are socialised into seeing themselves as inferior. Shakespeare also notes how people with disabilities are often isolated from one another, so they don't get to create a collective identity, which can help lead towards a positive identity. We can also see in society how there is a lack of positive role models within the media and within most people's everyday lives. So this could be leading to the challenge of positive identities for those with disability. So additionally, disability or impairment in a largely able-bodied society often leads to reactions of pity, avoidance and awkwardness. So we will look at an example now of a campaign which tried to challenge this. So during this lesson, we watched a campaign by Scope, which was called End the Awkward. They were a series of campaign adverts which were shown on Channel 4. It illustrated how people should speak to people with disabilities, challenging stigma in society. I'll try to add an example of a video to the playlist so you can get an idea of this campaign. A concept we can use when writing about disability is stigma, which is a negative label. Disabled people are given the label of disabled, and this then becomes their master status, the label which precedes all other labels. So this means that when people see or think about that individual, the first thing that they will think of is their disability. It is their defining characteristic. There are studies which state that disability isn't necessarily a key part of an individual's self-identity. By self-identity, I mean how they see themselves. One study is Murakami. He found that disabled people form their self-identity based on what they were able to do, rather than in terms of their disability. If their abilities are blocked by societal or environmental barriers, such as poor access or awareness, they then blame society rather than their impairment. Another study comes from Watson, who quoted an individual with a disability, who said, "I know this is going to sound very strange to you, but I do not see myself as a disabled person." This shows that not all disabled people see their disability as a limitation and a key part of their identity. These studies could be used for AO3 for a question which is asking you to evaluate the view that disability is a strong influence on an individual's identity, because they are saying that it is not a main part of their identity. Another sociologist who writes about disability is Zola. Zola was disabled after suffering from polio as a child. She wrote about the language used when talking about disability. She said, "The very vocabulary we use to describe ourselves is borrowed from discriminatory able-bodied society. We are deformed, diseased, disabled, disordered, abnormal, and most telling of all, we are called an invalid." She argues that this can lead to learned helplessness, which is a concept. This is the idea that some disabled people may internalise the idea that they are incapable of changing the situation and thus fail to take action to help themselves.
Here is a list of the studies and concepts covered in the disability and identity lesson. We had the medical model and the social model, and we had two different points which came from the sociologist Shakespeare. We also had the example of the End the Awkward campaign from the charity Scope, Also, there was the concepts stigma, label, and master status. And then we had three more sociologists. We had Murakami, Watson, and Zola. Zola also gave us the concept of learned helplessness.
You've probably guessed that the next identity we looked at was sexuality. I recommend that you give yourself a break before watching the next part of the video so you can help your mind keep the studies separate. In this lesson, we were looking at how sexuality can shape identity and how attitudes have changed over time. As with disability, you will find that sexuality won't seem like a key part of an individual's identity unless they aren't heterosexual. This opens up a discussion about heterosexuality being seen as the norm in society. The word gay means happy and carefree. This is why the homosexual community used it to describe their sexuality. Unfortunately, over time, this word has grown negative connotations. Something might be called gay as a way to suggest that something is lame or rubbish. I've heard it used much less recently nowadays, but you should always challenge the use of gay in this way, as otherwise it normalises prejudice attitudes. These can be unconscious, but it is still problematic for society. One study we looked at was Weeks. Weeks talks about how sexuality is a significant feature of gay, lesbian and bisexual's identity, but isn't for someone who is heterosexual. Homosexuality has not always been something which people could be open about, as it used to be illegal. Here we have some examples of men who have spent time in prison for alleged homosexual activity. The top left is Oscar Wilde, the top right is the late Lord Montague of Beaulieu, and the bottom is Alan Turner, who created the Enigma machine. In 1967, homosexuality was decriminalised for men over the age of 21. It was an improvement, yet it was not equal to the age of consent for heterosexual people, which was 16. Weeks also talks about coming out. He argues that engaging in homosexual behaviour doesn't automatically give someone a homosexual identity. He believes that people need to self-identify as gay. He gives the example of some people identifying as gay but not engaging in homosexual activity, and that some people may engage in homosexual activity but don't identify as gay. We can illustrate this idea further with the study by Rees. Rees was the study about the rent boys. A rent boy is a male prostitute who has sex with men. Rees found that the rent boys in his study would identify as heterosexual despite engaging in homosexual activity with men for money. He found that in order to neutralise their behaviour, they would actively despise their clients to try and reinforce their heterosexuality. Another sociologist we can use is McIntosh. He gave us the concept of the homosexual role. He believes that there are certain cultural characteristics associated with male homosexuality. In Western society, it is expected that a gay man will be flamboyant, camp, loud, and surrounded by women. He believed that men need to internalise their homosexuality before they will demonstrate the homosexual role. They would need to self-identify as gay before they would demonstrate these characteristics. The Gay Left Collective used the phrase, "Becoming a homosexual is a difficult process of becoming the other, or becoming what one has learned to despise." They are talking about how internalising homosexual identity can be challenging due to the prejudice attitudes which are embedded in society. The idea that homosexuality is going against the norm.
The previous studies that we have looked at have all focused on male homosexuality, but we also have a study from Rich, who talks about lesbianism. Rich argues that women's sexuality is oppressed by men in patriarchal, male-dominated society. It's assumed in our society that women will be heterosexual and will grow up to get married to a man and have children. Rich argues that women are socialized into compulsory heterosexuality, where they are subordinate to men. She is suggesting that heterosexuality is a social construction brought to us by patriarchy. She notes how lesbianism is often linked with empowerment and joy, yet it is seen as a threat to male dominance. This is due to it going against patriarchal expectations. Attitudes towards sexuality and identities have changed dramatically over time. Homosexuality is no longer seen as a condition, and the age of consent is now equalised to 16, though this only happened in 2000. It is also now illegal to discriminate against people due to their sexuality. This is outlined in the Equality Act of 2010. The studies and concepts covered in this lesson, the sexuality and identity lesson, are Weeks, Rees, Mackintosh and the homosexual role, the gay left collective and the idea of internalisation, Rich and compulsory heterosexuality, and the Equality Act of 2010.
The next identity is gender. It is important that you separate sexuality and gender in your understanding. Sexuality is in relation to sexual preference, whereas gender is whether you see yourself as masculine or feminine. Make sure that you can clearly identify studies for each of these identities and you keep them separate in your understanding, as you will never need to use them in the same question. Again, make sure that you take a break before starting on this part of the video to prevent the studies getting jumbled in your mind. The studies that feature in gender identity should feel familiar to you, as they can be used in gender inequality too. We started off this lesson trying to work out the gender of the Teletubbies, using different information about the behaviour of each of the Teletubbies and their favourite toys. In case you're curious or you can't remember, Tinky Winky and Dipsy were male Teletubbies and Laa-Laa and Po were female Teletubbies. Of course, this isn't of any use to you, but it helped us unpick the idea that there is socially constructed ways that males and females tend to behave. So this lesson focused mostly on Oakley. You should know Oakley inside out by now, but just in case you don't, then this will be a nice refresher for you. So first of all, it's important to distinguish the difference between sex and gender. Sex is the physical differences between males and females, whereas gender is how people identify, whether they are masculine or feminine. In sociology, we only look at gender. One view of how masculine and feminine gender roles are defined is from the biological view. Wilson believes that men need to be more promiscuous, so they therefore will have more sexual partners in order to spread the seed, so they can have more children. He believes that women need to look after the child and stay faithful to their man in order to ensure that he is there to help with the upbringing of the kids, to help provide. People nowadays often find this view as sexist and outdated, as it suggests that men can sleep around and are in fact biologically programmed to sleep around, whereas women can't. They're biologically programmed to look after the child and stay faithful to their man. Another traditional view of gender roles comes from the functionalist Parsons. Spend a few seconds thinking of the concepts he applies to the roles of men and women and what those roles entailed. Now, I'm sure you've all been able to remember this, as we've mentioned them hundreds of times in class. Parsons believes that men play the instrumental role, or they should play the instrumental role in the family. The man should act as the breadwinner. He goes out to work in order to financially support the family. That is his function. Whereas women play the expressive role, or the housewife, looking after the children and the husband because this is her function. Functionists believe that this is based on natural instinct, but is also reinforced during socialization. Feminists believe that we live in a patriarchal society, so male-dominated society. They believe that the gender roles that men and women take on are socially constructed. They are decided by society in order to maintain the dominance of men in society. The key feminist you need to know when we're talking about gender identities is Oakley. She did a study into gender role socialisation and found that the family socialised boys and girls into masculine and feminine gender roles. They did this through 4 concepts: manipulation, canalisation, verbal appellations, and domestic activities. So manipulation consists of encouraging behaviour that is seen as stereotypically acceptable for the child's gender and discouraging behaviour that is not considered the norm. Examples could include laughing if a boy gets muddy or congratulating for attempting something adventurous, but discouraging a girl from doing anything that would involve her getting muddy or dirty, or from even attempting adventurous activities. Another concept from Anne Oakley is canalisation. So canalisation involves parents channeling their child's interests into toys, games and activities that are considered the norm for their gender, such as encouraging girls to play with dolls and to go to ballet class, and encouraging boys to play football. Another concept is verbal appellations. This is the nicknames or pet names that are given to boys and girls to reinforce gender expectations. So as you can see listed here on the left, you've got some examples of pet names that may be given to a little girl to reinforce feminine gender roles. So things like princess, darling, flower, twinkle. All of these would be terms, verbal appellations used to talk about a little girl, but wouldn't tend to be used for a little boy. Names that may be used for a little boy would include ones like these. So soldier, champ, buddy, monster, tyke, those sorts of things. Very much more active and not so much delicate and sort of whimsical like the female ones. The final the final concept is domestic activities or different activities. So this is where parents or family members may encourage children to participate in activities around the home that reinforce stereotypes, such as the girl helping the mother with baking and a boy helping his father clean the car. Or, for example, like on the image there, the boy helping with lawn mowing. Other activities that might be seen as more feminine might include things like helping to do the washing up, helping to do the cleaning, those sorts of activities. Oakley only studied gender role socialisation within the family, so during primary socialisation. So you wouldn't relate Oakley to any points that you're making about education or the media. She doesn't say that parents necessarily do it intentionally, it is just the way that patriarchal society has made it the norm. Gender role socialisation doesn't end with the family. It happens through all agents of socialisation. We looked at 2 examples of how the peer group socialises boys and girls into gender roles. One study came from Hay and the other from Mack and Gale. So Hay looked at teenage girl friendship groups and found that the female peer group had a lot of power over girls' behaviour. She found that the norms of the female peer group are deeply rooted in patriarchal expectations. For example, she said that girls would use social control to regulate behaviour which was not fitting for their gender. Mack and Gale was the study that looked at the boys' peer groups at school and found that boys learned to be men in their peer groups at school, policing their own and others' sexuality. He believed that gender power was based on hypermasculinity, so extreme, over-the-top masculinity. He thought that this was the main source of identity for the macho lads. They valued the 3 Fs and reinforced them, which therefore encouraged males to demonstrate this macho lad sort of mentality, this hypermasculinity.
The studies and concepts covered in the gender and identity lesson are the biological view from Watson, functionalism and Parsons, and he spoke about the instrumental role, the breadwinner, and the expressive role. We had Oakley, and she spoke about manipulation, canalisation, verbal appellations, and domestic activities. We also had Hay, who spoke about teenagers and girls in particular social groups, and Mackengale's idea of the 3S and socialising into hypermasculinity. In addition to the lesson spent looking at gender identities, we spent a lesson looking at how gender identities have changed over time. Again, give yourself another break so that your mind can distinguish between the content from this lesson and the previous gender identities part of the video. One of the studies we looked at was Connell. She identified 4 different types of masculinity. Pause the video here and see whether you can recall each one of them and their characteristics. The images along the bottom should help you. Firstly, there was hegemonic masculinity. This is a male gender identity that defines what it means to be a real man. Men who don't want to be regarded as wimps, abnormal, or odd are meant to accomplish this masculinity. It features such things as toughness, aggression, competitiveness, control, success, and power over and subordination of women. Secondly, there's marginalised masculinity. Marginalised masculinity is a form of masculinity that is unable to conform to hegemonic masculinity. Marginalised masculinity is often associated with men who are frustrated in their position in society, as men are gaining more control. Next, we have subordinate masculinity. So subordinate masculinity means a person lacks many of the qualities of hegemonic masculinity and also expresses qualities opposite to hegemonic masculinity. This includes things like being overly emotional or acting in a feminine way, or not being heterosexual. This is very much the sort of masculinity that is seen as associated with homosexual males. Finally, there is complicit masculinity. Complicit masculinity is a kind of masculinity that does not challenge the dominant forms of masculinity in Western society. These are men who share in gender roles which might have traditionally been seen as more feminine. For example, looking after the children or sharing in housework. We watched this Levi's advert, which was called The Laundrette, and we discussed how the image of this male differed from that of Connell's idea of hegemonic masculinity. You can still find this video on YouTube. Just search for Laundrette on YouTube if you wish to watch it again. We had 2 studies that built on the Laundrette advert. One of them was from Nixon. Nixon studied the influence of the Levi's advert, and he argued that this sent a message that it was cool for men to take care of their appearance. Mort also wrote about the images portrayed in the Levi's advert and said that there was an emerging type of masculinity called the new man. The new man was a target for consumerism, and now there are various products such as toiletries and fashion items available for men to buy to take care of their image. Mort argues that men have become sexualized. Both of these studies demonstrate how masculinity is now starting to include things that were previously reserved for feminine identity. Mackengale wrote another study, a different one to the one previously mentioned in the last lesson. This study said that men were experiencing a crisis of masculinity. So Mackengale said that working class men were feeling under threat as the workplace was becoming more feminised. There has been a loss of the breadwinner identity due to the decline of traditional male industries such as mining. So they're entering this crisis, they're feeling this sense of frustration, not sure where they fit in society anymore. We didn't only look at the changing masculinities, we also looked at changing femininities through Jackson's study of the Ladettes. Jackson found that some women were forming a ladette subculture, which demonstrated a behaviour which would usually be associated with males. She found that ladettes would be loud, would binge drink, swear, fight, smoke, and be sexually promiscuous. Jackson found that this ladette behaviour was being demonstrated by teenage girls in schools. She found that teachers would look less favourably upon this behaviour being demonstrated by a girl than they would if the behaviour was coming from a boy. This therefore shows that there was a double standard in the expectations for boys and girls in education. In this part of the video, in the changing gender identities part, we looked at a few more studies. We had Connell and her concepts of hegemonic masculinity, marginalized masculinity, subordinate masculinity, and complicit masculinity. We had Nixon and the New Man, Mort and the New Man, and the idea of metrosexuality, so taking care of your appearance, and men taking care of their appearance, but it not reflecting on their sexuality. Mack and Gale's concept of the crisis of masculinity, and Jackson's concept of the ladettes. There are a total of 21 studies in this weekly roundup, which are going to need plenty of revision. The next weekly roundup I will be publishing during half term, which will include the 20-mark question, social class identities, changing class identities, and age identities. I will do a challenge activity on the next 2 weekly roundups during our first lesson back after half term, so make sure you are checking back and revisiting them over the break. This half term break should be a great opportunity for you to start your revision and get it all organised in order to help you progress towards your goal grade. This weekly roundup will be assessed in lesson on Monday.